This is the second part of the second study cafe in philosophy of science. Before we get started with another couple of exercises, just want to remind you that you've received a link for an evaluation of the class that I hope you'll spend a few minutes on filling out so I can learn from this entire course, this process, and what I should think about in the future in terms of the perception that you have. Okay, here we have the first example, another research design example. Please take a few minutes to read this case, this information, and consider what your answer to the question would be. So it's a fairly large sample, and some of the percentages are really different in the sense that customers at Netto apparently notice a mistake far more often than customers at Lidl and Irma, etc. And the question is, can we actually infer anything from this? Again, it's something about who has responded to this survey. Well, apparently they're a representative sample in the sense that they're similar to other people and representing other people in Denmark. But who are Netto customers? And who are Irma or Bilka or Føtex customers? So might it be the case that, and I've outlined these things on the next slide, might it be the case that people who buy in Netto are just different and have a tendency to always check their receipt, while people that shop in Lidl or Irma, they just basically very rarely check their receipt? Could also be the case that people that go to Netto, they go there all the time, which maybe a Netto customer has been there 20 times on average, while an Irma customer has only been there 3 times on average, which would mean that the Netto customer would be much more likely at some point to stumble upon a mistake. Could also be something about the amount of money one spends in various places. Maybe customers at Bilka actually spend a lot of money and buy a lot of stuff, maybe even some electronics, which will make them more likely to, check the receipt. So again, think about the sample. Are we sure that the differences we see in the different experiences they have, that it's due to the different experiences? Is it because the supermarket is different? Or is it because the customers are different? Is it because they have different kinds of experiences, spend different kinds of money? Again, we cannot infer that it's just that the supermarket makes various kinds of mistakes. It might be some kind of selection issue that is at play here. Okay, let's go for a different kind of question. This is not a research design question as such. This is just sort of more general, broad, dealing with the topics that we've discussed in the curriculum. So please spend some minutes thinking about what topics do you think you could include, how would you structure this answer, what would you come up with, and I'll give some indications of what good answers could look like afterwards. Yes, so what you then might have noticed while you were considering and thinking about what part of the curriculum to include here is that there's actually quite a few things that we could dive into. What is a theory? How true can it be? And there's even a specific comparison with physics in there. So this is just a very crude overview of some perspectives that you could include. This does not mean that any good answer has to include this many. Fine just to have a couple, 2 or 3 that really gets your point across. As you can see, there are a couple, one down here, that explicitly talk about physics and how social sciences is different from physics, what's in the Nelson paper. We could also rely on the Guba perspectives, the different isms that is also outlined in the Kuhn text, or also indirectly comes into play in the Aschwanden text. There is a there. That does not mean that we get the full truth, but maybe we can get closer to it. Yeah, as I said, I won't go through all these elements in detail, but it does give you an indication of what kind of perspectives one could include, and there are others you could put on top of it as well. So let's do another exercise that is not research design focused as such. Try to read these 3 statements and consider which one of them it sort of sounds the least like something Aschwanden might have written. Okay, now that you've spent some time on reading them, thinking about them, let's try to consider what's in play here. As you can see, there is something about the second statement that does not quite fit. But let's look at the other ones first. So the first one here, it's something about we should look at the process rather than the answer. That is something that is being implied. We will reduce uncertainty in the scientific process. That is clearly something that is a message. And science is complicated. Well, that's given by the headline about how science is not broken, but just really, really difficult. And provisional truth is something that is clearly, as a message that is clearly put forward in the paper. No absolute certainty. So this first message, this first statement seems to fit. Third one talks about a messy process, how there are often not quite unambiguous choices of how to deal with a scientific challenge. That's the whole essence of both the American economy and different political parties interactive point that is made on the webpage, but also the point about the 29 research teams that analyzed football data. The exact point was that there is no unambiguous way of analyzing this data. It can still have high validity. It's just different approaches are meaningful. So again, this does overall fit what Aschwanden is trying to portray and trying to say. Let's do the second statement here. Well, maybe the first one is not sort of quite an issue, the first sentence, but it's stated here, when most have reached agreement, it's also clear they've reached a true answer. There's no link between some kind of democratic consensus approach, or there's also no kind of indication of that we can get the true answer, whether it's from consensus or not. So this does not seem to fit with what Aschwanden was trying to portray in her text. Let's go to this last example here, and this, I should emphasize, is quite difficult. This is not an easy thing to try to identify. So there's a claim emphasized in red here, and then maybe pay attention to some of the stuff written in bold in particular. Try to read this and consider what's going on here. Why is this claim not entirely precise? Okay, so we have fairly large data set, as you can see, lots of Twitter, lots of Twitter accounts, lots of cascades, lots of tweets. It's spread by 3 million people, so okay, it's a large data set. I don't really know a lot about these Twitter accounts, but okay. What's the claim? False story spreads significantly more than any true story. Then we should consider what are these false and true stories that they are comparing. Where is this data coming from? What characterizes this? As you can see, they've identified thousands of true and false stories, relying on these 6 independent fact-checking organizations. These sites have selected stories that are under suspicion of being false and investigated them. So they haven't just taken any false or true story. They've taken stories that are sort of under suspicion of being either true or false. So it should say, we find that when we consider stories that are under suspicion of being false, then it turns out that those that are in fact false spread more than those that were thought to be false, but actually were true. It's also highlighted here in sort of a different angle. In this tweet here, it says, for many years, the most retweeted post in Twitter's history celebrated Obama's re-election as president. This is something that is just so clearly and explicitly true that no fact-checking organization would begin to investigate it. So there are some true stories out there that just never isn't considered, isn't part of the sample, and hence the claim that false stories are spread more widely. Well, you actually haven't investigated this completely. So the next tweet is then making the same point, that to what degree can we generalize the claim that false stories spread more? And as he said, verified contested false news. That's really the data set that they had. So either it was false or not false. But they haven't looked at news stories that might be contested, but they weren't checked by these 6 independent fact-checking organizations. And they certainly haven't sort of direct data on any kind of false news. So as this sort of visualization is trying to illustrate, there's limitation to how far you can generalize. What's the strength of the external validity? You have, on the data set, you can very clearly say something, make a strong point. The internal validity is high. But the moment you go across the data set, try to say something more about the world, something more generic about what you specifically have data on, then the external validity comes weaker. Sort of the more broadly you want to say something about contested false news stories that's been fact-checked, contested false news, or false news more in general. The more you sort of want to generalize and extrapolate, the weaker the point becomes.